After surviving a possible impeachment in the aftermath of the Farmgate scandal, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa is talking tough as his party, the African National Congress, celebrated its 111th year anniversary. In his speech over the weekend, the president said that the ANC acknowledged that South Africans are at a moment of fundamental consequence in the life of the country. Just before the anniversary celebrations, the ANC met on Thursday to fine-tune its policies and adopt new ones with load shedding, social grants, the Reserve Bank's independence, immigration rules, and management of state companies on the agenda. Some of the policies discussed were not new. The party has taken decisions on them, but never implemented those decisions. Joining me now is Sanusha Naidu. She's a policy analyst and, of course, a friend of Business Edge. Sanusha, welcome to Business Edge again. Let me take this opportunity to tell you Happy New Year as well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good day to you. Happy New Year to you, your listeners, viewers everywhere. And it's always a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you again for the invitation.
All right, so we have to start with probably one of the, I would say, hottest topics in South Africa, but probably cold because people are not able to get hot, and that's electricity. What record we have right now is that there are more than 160 days of load shedding in 2022, and the situation escalated in the last 2 weeks of December. So the ANC is saying that they recognize that there is an energy crisis, but they would largely stick to the current path that they've taken. The party says it wants Eskom to continue to play a central role in bolstering electricity supply, while government should look at using natural gas and more nuclear power to ensure a transition to renewable energy does not put the country at a disadvantage. It also suggests that the country's weak transmission grid should be strengthened and there should be development of green hydrogen and electric vehicle industries should be prioritized. So when you hear this in terms of where the direction that the ANC proposal on energy and electricity particularly is going, do you see this as really the ANC truly recognizing the damage and harm that Eskom's challenges have cost the economy and South Africans?
Yeah, no, I think the tone and the statement itself is an acknowledgement of the crisis that we have with our energy grid, our access to energy, and of course the kind of how much of megawatts we actually have in the grid at the moment. The president has just done an interview in one of our local media stations, and he spoke about having at least about minimum, I suspect, 18,000 watts of electricity at any given time within the national grid. And I think that the statement that you read out is an acknowledgement of how dire the consequences are when your electricity grid tends to bottom out and bomb out in the way that it has because of power stations that are constantly being taken out of the grid, or they're failing because the substations are not working. So you kind of understand the implications this has for business. And I think the point you made about 2022 being the year where the electricity outages has cost this economy so much, and its business and its people, its lives, its livelihoods, etc. And of course, right now in South Africa, we are in summer, and that also means that the people are trying to keep cool, and of course they can't, as you rightly point out. And of course, the other problem we have is that we have runaway fires, etc. People are using flammable material to keep to cook and so forth. So we kind of in a very dire set of consequences here. Does this mean that they have a plan? Does it mean that they're basically going to tell us in the next couple of weeks after the cabinet Lekgotla, and of course the president also indicated that he'll come back and he'll address us as a nation, and of course based on where things are. It's very difficult to extrapolate that from the statement. I think the statement is about rhetoric, but the statement doesn't provide a kind of, the how. The stages around which. I know the president has in his interview indicated that it is a mammoth task, that the question of our electricity crisis doesn't exist just in a vacuum. It's been there for the longest time ever. But I think it also raises the question around why we actually in this predicament. Why is it that these infrastructure and the maintenance and the kind of bringing on stream, the kind of electricity alternatives that we have, whether it's nuclear, whether it's renewables, etc., and they speak about a just transition and a green economy, all of that means that it's going to be costly, and it's a real challenge for us. So I think for me personally, whilst I acknowledge that the president and the statement makes a very important indication and recognition and acknowledgement of what the crisis is, I just don't see how we get out of it. And that's where the real kind of challenge lies in this statement and in what was said yesterday.
Talk about the terms of the how, because we've heard from the president the past year or two that they would be allowing, of course, more renewables to come online, possibly even looking at ESCOM being separated into 3 different units on its own. But all of that is a conversation, but there have been simply not enough action towards that direction. So you talk about the cost, and you talk about how, of course, it's cost the economy, which takes us to the next point, which is a very interesting one that I think many people picked up on. And that was the proposal about changes to the South Africa Reserve Bank. So interestingly enough, this is one of the handful of global central banks that is owned by investors. That includes individuals, commercial banks, and even pension funds. And though shareholders really have no say over monetary policy, and that's important to note as well. But the ANC is proposing that they change that, and it should be that the state should own the central bank. And that would mean changing, of course, the South Africa Reserve Bank Act and more than that. But when you look at this proposal coming up, in terms of the timing and in terms of the why, what do you make of it?
Well, this proposal has been on the resolution cards for the ANC for the longest time ever. Yes. So it doesn't come up as a surprise that the Reserve Bank is basically being asked, or they're being proposed, that it should actually be under state control and ownership. Now, if you read the resolutions from previous elective conferences, there is the question of affordability. Can the state afford to buy out those shares of the private owners or the private investors in the bank? But also it means that you've got to think about what is your monetary policy, and more importantly, is it one of the same? So if the state takes control, is it going to change monetary policy? And I think this is where even around the world, and I was listening to your business news just before we came on air, and I think it's a dilemma for most central banks around the world, is how do they deal with the liquidity crunch in the market? How do they prevent runaway inflation? And how do they actually deal with the fact that they want to contain that consumer inflation and what that means in terms of the impact on the economy? So increasing the interest rates is one way in which you kind of have a fail-safe measure. But I think the problem or the challenge rather, that we see with the Reserve Bank question in South Africa and the question of ownership, etc., is it going to deal with the crisis that we have in monetary policy? Because I think what happens with central banks around the world is they, like sheep, they flock to doing the same thing, and they look at data coming out of the US, they look at what the Fed does in the US, they look at what China is doing now with the COVID issue, they look at other markets. So the sustainability and the vulnerability is quite severe. The other thing that you've got to remember came out of the closure of the business of the elective conference, which ended last week. Remember, the business of the elective conference was then not completed in 2022, but completed in the first week of January, which was last week. They also spoke about the mandate of the Reserve Bank taking in not just a very narrow approach around monetary policy, yes, but to expand a bit of the definition around unemployment, how to deal with unemployment, because that's also a critical issue.
And it's interesting you bring up that point, because there seems to be a difference in understanding of what's really the remit and the mandate or responsibility of the SARB should be. ANC wants to expand that so that the SARB is looking more into employment, of course, increasing the profitability or whatever it is of the economy as well, and also broadening it to shore up the economy and promote employment, as you said. So let's look at something else. We've had conversations about this next point of the policy review, and that is, of course, state companies. So the African National Congress is proposing a comprehensive review of all state-owned entities to determine which of them should be retained, consolidated, or repositioned. And there has been little follow-up on previous suggestions that the government should also sell non-core assets. So when we look at the conclusions of the Zondo Commission, which we've talked about, interstate capture and some of the state company scandals we saw in 2021 and 2022, we know that South Africa has a serious problem on its hands. Would this review really see the light of day, given how deeply entrenched graft, corruption, nepotism is in many of these state companies? And if it was to see the light of day, would it really achieve anything for South Africa?
I'd like to be cautiously optimistic here and think that when the president spoke yesterday, he spoke about the Zondo Commission recommendations, and he spoke about how important those recommendations are to be implemented. And of course, we do know that those recommendations also implicate some members in his cabinet as well as in the ANC on his National Executive Council. Now, this comprehensive review that you're talking about, that he spoke about again, I think for me, the challenge is that you don't need another comprehensive review. You actually need to find the leakage. You need to you understand where some of the leakage and some of the malfeasance is, where the recklessness is with regard to governance of these state-owned enterprises, and you need to start dealing with them in a much more cohesive, coherent, and decisive manner. So the review, I think, in a sense, is now basically we kind of also getting into another review, which I don't think, in my opinion, we can afford, but we don't need, because we kind of understand from where we're sitting that the crisis within the state-owned enterprises arena is one that has to do with not just Eskom. You look at Transnet, you look at Denel, you look at your other state-owned enterprises. And I think the ones that get all of the airtime are the ones that constantly have been flagged within the Zondo Commission. But if you look at SAA, for example, as well, so I think the challenge is not necessarily that we need to do another comprehensive review. I think you need to start taking the Zondo Commission report and start thinking about what it is that we need to start addressing and what is the decisive action that needs to be. You need to deal with those that have defrauded those companies. You need to also ask the question of whether, and this was a resolution, I don't know if they came to any kind of concrete conclusion on, but it was a proposal being made that maybe Eskom should be moved from its current portfolio being under the Ministry of Public Enterprises to the Ministry of Mineral Resources and Development. Now, again, this is not necessarily dealing with the challenge of what is the crisis of your SOEs, but it's not necessarily meaning that moving it into another ministry will actually deal with that crisis. So I think that what the president needs to think about very strategically with his core task team that he has that advises him on these issues is whether or not the comprehensive review is going to be something that's going to really turn around the status quo of the SOEs. Or is it going to actually just kind of tell us this is the problem and then we're still going to wait for the implementation of action?
And there's a lot to that because people are worried about moving something like an Eskom, as you said earlier, to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, then having SAA move also to the Department of Transportation. Isn't that just shuffling the issue around, as you've pointed out? Okay, I would have loved to touch base on the social welfare grants, but unfortunately there's not time. But I have to ask you this, Sanusha, do you think that there's anything that you expected to hear in terms of policy proposals, whether old or new, that you didn't hear from the ANC in these meetings that they had on Thursday? Is there something that the ANC doesn't seem to really be touching base on that is a critical issue for South Africans and the economy?
I think we kind of seen a lot of the hangover proposals that haven't been dealt with or have been kind of revised and going forward. The one thing I thought that we could have heard more about, but we kind of had a touch on it in the president's statement yesterday, in the January 8th statement, was on the step-aside rule. I think the step-aside rule has been stepped aside. So there's a lot of questions around whether the step-aside rule is going to go forward in the way that it has been envisaged. But I think what was interesting for me is the fact that it's all of these resolutions, we have to read them in tandem with each other and in context. We can't take them out and read them out of context because each of them seem to have a rider to them in their implementation.
And that's something that we'll get deeper into. Hopefully, as you said, we'll be hearing more about the details, the context, and of course, the riders to these proposals and what the next step may be for the ANC on them. Thank you so much for your time, as usual, Sanusha. We'll be speaking to you soon.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Now, it's one thing to propose and another to implement, and the African National Congress has proposed and failed to follow through on several policy proposals before. There is also a general election in 2024. We saw the ANC lose some ground in the 2021 municipal elections to newly formed opposition parties that advocated a harder line on immigration, which was also something that had a proposal. But how important will the economic fortunes of South Africans and South Africa in 2023 be to elections that are coming in more than a year? It's a conversation we'll be following very closely behind. Again, as we said, the ANC has celebrated 111 years. That's the anniversary celebrated this weekend of the African National Congress, which continues to lead South Africa and looks to do that beyond 2024.